Welcome back, my dear followers. This is a new episode of The History of the American Mafia, a podcast written by Fabio Fabiano, translated and read by Grace Cartlisi. I do hope you enjoy today's new episode. This is part one of a two-part series on Joseph Bonanno. Joseph Bonanno was also known as Joe Bananas, a rather peculiar nickname which was given to him after a misprint put in the press at the time. This nickname stuck with him throughout his life, and he detested it because it gave the impression to others that he was crazy. Bonanno was one of the most important Italian-American mafiosis, head of one of the most powerful New York underworld families, known to this day as the Bonanno family. He was born in Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily. His parents, Salvatore and Caterina Bonventre, emigrated to the United States when young Joseph was only 1 year old. They settled in Brooklyn, where Salvatore opened a bar restaurant. In 1911, Salvatore was recalled by his brothers to Sicily, where the family business was threatened by a rival gang. Therefore, Bonanno mostly grew up in Sicily. His father died in 1915, his mother 5 years later, making Joseph an orphan at the age of 15. He was sent the following year to a boarding school in Palermo. On the 30th of October 1922, the King, Vittorio Emanuele III, appointed Mussolini as Prime Minister, thereby transferring political power to the fascists without armed conflict. Mussolini took radical measures to fight the mafia by sending Super Prefect Cesare Mori with full powers. Mori, using brutal methods, managed to obtain significant results in the fight against the mafia. In 1925, after joining the mafia and trying to prevent Mussolini from taking control of Sicily, Bonanno and his friend and colleague, classmate Pietro Margadino, founded a group of anti-fascist students. Due to the formation of the subversive association, an arrest warrant was issued against them. The young associates were forced to flee to Marseille and then to Paris, finally to end up in Cuba. From Cuba, Joe began an illegal smuggling business from the island to Florida. Finally, in 1927, he returned to Brooklyn and lived in Roebling Street and Metropolitan Avenue, where he had grown up. He was then 19 years of age and lived with his uncle, a hairdresser, Peter Bonventre. He frequented an environment of mafiosi, many of whom came from Castellammare del Golfo, his hometown. His home base was Brooklyn, where he committed thefts and was involved in rigged lottery games. In the mafia world, Bonanno was noticed by his peers for having good organization skills and a certain flair. His mentor was Salvatore Maranzano. To understand the figure of Maranzano, we must refer to the criminal history of Don Vito Casciofero, the well-known Italian mafia boss forced to flee the USA following an investigation conducted by the well-known policeman Joe Petrosino. Despite being forced to leave America, Don Vito Casciofero cultivated the dream of controlling the American mafia. Therefore, in 1927 he decided to send his most loyal man, Salvatore Maranzano, to the United States to collaborate with Bonanno in order to bring the Italian-American mafia under his control. Their headquarters was in North Williamsburg, a Brooklyn neighborhood. Maranzano, as leader of the Brooklyn mafia family, waged a fight against the person who had control over the entire New York mafia, Joe the Boss Masseria. In 1927, the two rival factions, that of Masseria and that of Maranzano, clashed. The conflict was named the Castellammare War and lasted 4 years. The strife ended following Lucky Luciano's betrayal and the murder of Joe Masseria. In 1931, with the subsequent murder of Salvatore Maranzano, Also decided by Lucky Luciano and his criminal group, the National Commission of the Crime Syndicate was established, and the territory of New York was divided between 5 families. One of these was led by Bonanno, who at the time of the events was just 26 years old, which made him one of the youngest leaders of all times. Peace reigned between the families for 20 years. The Bonanno family counted among its most influential members Frank Garofalo, John Bonventre, and Carmine Galante. Illegal activities mainly focused on loan sharking, illegal betting, illegal lotteries, and control of prostitution. Although it was one of the smallest families in New York, in terms of members, it was particularly effective. The money raised by Bonanno was laundered into legitimate businesses such as clothing, dairy products, Italian delicacies, and funeral homes, although he did undergo some minor setbacks. For example, his clothing factory was prosecuted for violating labor laws. Joe Bonanno didn't like being in the spotlight, unlike many mafiosis of the time who attended social parties and elite events dressed as Hollywood stars, as if they were almost part of the starlight world. Joe, on the other hand, tried to keep a low profile, although, despite his attempts, he found himself at the center of the press's interest. In the 1960s, Bonanno began to expand his influence into Arizona and California. But other leaders of the mafia family viewed Bonanno's thirst for power negatively, an opinion which would later lead to repercussions. During this period, Bonanno invested in casinos in Cuba with Meyer Lansky and started other illegal businesses in Canada. Meanwhile, in New York, the other godfathers began to suspect that Bonanno wanted to infiltrate his men into their territories controlled by their gangs. In the 1950s, he took on the role of peacemaker. The Pax Bonanno reigned amongst American mafia families, and what better occasion to celebrate this new golden age than a wedding party? The occasion, it was the celebration of his son Salvatore's wedding to Rosalia Profaci, the daughter of another known mafia boss. The reception took place at the Astor Hotel in Manhattan, and 3,000 people participated, including businessmen, politicians, priests, and other ecclesiastical figures. The director of the newspaper, Il Progresso Italo-Americano, and many others. In August 1957, he came to Italy for the opening of an orphanage in Sicily. At Fiumicino Airport, he received a triumphant welcome, including eminent politicians from the Christian Democracy political party.